Chapter 5. The Fifth Commandment. 1. The authority of the family. Before analyzing the biblical law with respect to the honoring of parents and their authority, it is necessary to take note of the extensive undermining of the biblical doctrine of the family. In the Ten Commandments, 4 laws deal with the family, 3 of them directly. Honor thy father and mother. Thou shalt not commit adultery. Thou shalt not steal. And thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's house. Thou shalt not covet thy neighbor's wife, nor his manservant, nor his maidservant, nor his ox, nor his ass, nor anything that is thy neighbor's. Exodus 20:12, 14, 15, and 17. The fact that property, and hence theft, were family-oriented appears not only in all the law, but in the 10th commandment. To covet, whether property, wife, or servants of another, was a sin against the neighbor's family. The family is clearly central to the biblical way of life, and it is the family under God which has this centrality. But it must be added that this biblical perspective is alien to the Darwinian worldview. Evolutionary thought concedes the centrality of the family, but only as a historical fact. The family is seen as the great primitive institution, now rapidly being superseded, but important for studies of man's evolutionary past. The family is seen as the old collectivity, or collectivism, which must give way to the new collectivity. As the old collectivism which is resisting change, the family is steadily attacked by evolutionary social scientists, educators, and clergymen. The evolutionary anthropology which undergirds this attack owes much, after Darwin, to William Robertson Smith, 1846 to 1894, The Religion of the Semites. Darwin and Smith in turn gave Sigmund Freud, 1856 to 1939, his basic premises. In terms of this perspective as presented by Freud, but also made popular by Sir James G. Frazer's The Golden Bough, the origins of the family are in man's primitive past, rather than God's creative purpose. The quote-unquote primal horde, or primitive society, was dominated by the quote-unquote violent primal father, who drove out the sons and claimed exclusive sexual possession of the mother and the daughters. The quote-unquote origin of morality in each of us comes from the Oedipus complex. The rebellious sons who envied and feared the father banded together, killed and ate the father, and then possessed the mother and the sisters sexually. Their remorse and guilt over their acts created 3 basic taboos for man: parricide, cannibalism, and incest. For Freud in Christianity, the son makes atonement on the cross for killing the father, and cannibalism is transformed into a sacrament, the communion. With this in mind, we can understand why anthropologists can say, quote, "The family is the most fundamental of all social groups, and it is universal in its distribution," end quote. The next sentence informs us, however, that the family is a quote-unquote culturally determined social form. That is, it is entirely an evolutionary product of man's culture. Accordingly, the subject of, quote, religion and ritual is introduced in the course of an analysis of the, quote, extension of kinship. The power of the parent and the security of the family are, in religion, projected against the hostile environment to give it a participating kinship and favor to man. Accordingly, we are told there are 2 kinds of religions, the religion of the mother and the religion of the father. Thus, Vanderloo wrote, quote, "There is nothing more sacred on earth than the religion of the mother, for it leads us back to the deepest personal secret in our souls, to the relationship between the child and its mother. In these terms, Otto Kern has crystallized the essence of our theme, believing that behind power he descries the outlines of a form. Man recognizes therein the features of his own mother. His loneliness when confronted with power thus transforms itself into the intimate relationship to the mother," end quote. The origin of fertility cults is seen in the worship of the mother, an invoking of fertility as well as a return to the security of the womb. The mother cult leads eventually to the father cult. According to Vanderloo, quote, "To every man his mother is a goddess, just as his father is a god, end quote. Moreover, quote, the mother creates life, the father history, end quote. That is, the fertility cult religions are matters of prehistory and of primitive cultures, whereas the father as God is a stage of man's development in history. Vanderloo admitted in commenting on Isaiah 63:16 and 64:8 that the biblical God, quote, is not the figure of the generator, but of a creator, whose relations to man are the precise opposite of kinship, and before whose will man bows in deep but trustful dependence, end quote. But having noted this, he returned to his evolutionary thesis. Religion, thus, is seen as a projection of the family, and the family must therefore be destroyed, in order that religion may also be destroyed. But this is not all. Private property is similarly seen as an outgrowth of the family, and the abolition of private property requires the destruction of the family as a prerequisite. Vanderloo spoke of the relationship between the family and property, quote, among many peoples still further, property also plays a part as the common element of the family, for property is not just the object which the owner possesses, it is a power, and indeed a common power. Thus we find the common element of the family bound up with blood and with property. But it is not confined to these, for it is sacred, and therefore cannot be derived without any remainder from the given, end quote. According to Hobel, quote, the essential nature of property is to be found in social relations rather than in any inherent attribute of the thing or object that we call property. Property, in other words, is not a thing, but a network of social relations that governs the conduct of people with respect to the use and disposition of things, end quote. This is a typical little trick of the modern humanistic intellectual: dispose of a problem by defining it away. For Hobel, property is not, quote, a thing, but a network of social relations, end quote. And what do these social relations govern? Hobel's last word makes it clear. They govern things. What are these things, if not property? But it was Friedrich Engels who most plainly stated the humanistic case, and the Marxist thesis, concerning the relationship between property and the family. The monogamous family, he held, quote, is based on the supremacy of the man, the express purpose being to produce children of undisputed paternity. Such paternity is demanded because these children are later to come into their father's property as his natural heirs, end quote. Monogamy has reduced the importance of women and has led to, quote, the brutality towards women that has spread since the introduction of monogamy, end quote. Monogamy and the modern individual family rests or is, quote, founded on the open or concealed domestic slavery of the wife, end quote. The original group marriage has given way to pairing marriage, and finally to monogamy, whose concomitants are, quote, adultery and prostitution, end quote. Communism will abolish both traditional monogamy and private property. Quote, we are now approaching a social revolution in which the economic foundations of monogamy as they have existed hitherto will disappear, just as surely as those of its complement, prostitution. Monogamy arose from the concentration of considerable wealth in the hands of a single individual, a man, and from the need to bequeath this wealth to the children of that man and of no other. Having arisen from economic causes, will monogamy then disappear when these causes disappear? One might answer, not without reason, far from disappearing. It will on the contrary be realized completely. For with the transformation of the means of production into social property, there will disappear also wage labor, the proletariat, and therefore the necessity for a certain, statistically calculable, number of women to surrender themselves for money. Prostitution disappears. Monogamy, instead of collapsing, at last becomes a reality, also for men. With the transfer of the means of production into common ownership, the single family ceases to be the economic unit of society. Private housekeeping is transformed into a social industry. The care and education of the children becomes a public affair. Society looks after all children alike, whether they are legitimate or not. This removes all the anxiety about the quote-unquote consequences, which today is the most essential social, moral, as well as economic factor that prevents a girl from giving herself completely to the man she loves. Will not that suffice to bring about the gradual growth of unconstrained sexual intercourse, and with it a more tolerant public opinion in regard to a maiden's honor? and a woman's shame. And finally, have we not seen that in the modern world, monogamy and prostitution are indeed contradictions, but inseparable contradictions, poles of the same state of society? Can prostitution disappear without dragging monogamy with it into the abyss? End quote. Engel's view of marriage was that of an easily dissolved tie based only on love, with freedom for any association without penalty. Very clearly, biblical marriage was to be abolished with the abolition of private property. It becomes apparent then why modern humanistic education and especially Marxist education is so hostile to the family and so clearly dedicated to replacing the quote-unquote old collectivity of the family with the quote new collectivity, the state. To destroy the monogamous biblical family means, from their perspective, the destruction first of religion and second of private property. The Marxist wants to quote-unquote emancipate woman by making her an industrial worker. This is quote-unquote emancipation by definition, because it frees woman from the biblical religion-marriage-property complex. In order to counteract these humanistic conceptions of the family and of the parental role, the biblical doctrine of the family, which is plainly God-centered, must be understood and stressed. The humanistic doctrine of the family is man-centered and society-centered. The family is seen as a social institution which, in the course of evolution, provided the original and, quote, old collectivity, and must now give way to, quote, the new collectivity, as mankind becomes the true family of man. As already noted, the first characteristic of the biblical doctrine is that the family is viewed in terms of a God-centered function and origin. The family is a part of God's purpose for man, and it functions to the glory of God in its true form, as well as giving man his own self-realization under God. Second, Genesis 1:27-30 makes it clear that God created man to subdue the earth and to exercise dominion over it under God. Although originally only Adam was created, Genesis 2:7, the creation mandate is plainly spoken to man in the married estate, and with the creation of woman in mind. Thus, essential to the function of the family under God and to the role of the man as the head of the household is the call to subdue the earth and exercise dominion over it. This gives to the family a possessive function. To subdue the earth and exercise dominion over it clearly involves, in the biblical perspective, private property. Man must bring to all creation God's law order, exercising power over creation in the name of God. The earth was created, quote, very good, but it was as yet undeveloped in terms of subjugation and possession by man, God's appointed governor. This government is particularly the calling of the man as husband and father, and of the family as an institution. The fall of man has not altered this calling, although it has made its fulfillment impossible apart from Christ's regenerating work. Third, this exercise of dominion and possession clearly involves responsibility and authority. Man is responsible to God for his use of the earth and must, as a faithful governor, discharge his calling only in terms of his sovereign's royal decree or word. His calling confers also on him an authority by delegation. To man is given authority by God over his household and over the earth. In the Marxist scheme, the transfer of authority from the family to the state makes any talk of the family as an institution ridiculous. The family is, to all practical intent, abolished whenever the state determines the education, vocation, religion, and the discipline of the child. The only function remaining then to the parents is procreation, and by means of birth control regulations, this too is subject now to a diminishing role. The family in such a society is simply a relic of the old order, maintaining itself only surreptitiously and illegally, and subject at all times to the intervening authority of the state. In all modern societies, the transfer of authority from the family to the state has been accomplished in varying degrees. In the biblical perspective, the authority of the family is basic to society, and it is a God-centered authority. Hence, the common division of the commandment into 2 tables, or 2 sides of 5 each, with the 5th commandment placed alongside those relating to man's duty to God. The meaning of the family is thus not to be sought in procreation, but in a God-centered authority and responsibility in terms of man's calling to subdue the earth and to exercise dominion over it. Fourth, the function of the woman in this aspect of God's law order is to be a helpmeet to man in the exercise of his dominion and authority. She provides companionship in his calling, Genesis 2:18, so that there is a community in authority, with the clear preeminence being the man's. Man's sin is to attempt to usurp God's authority, and woman's sin is to attempt to usurp man's authority, and both attempts are a deadly futility. Eve exercised leadership in submitting to the temptation. She led Adam rather than being led. Adam succumbed to the desire to be as God, Genesis 3:5, while acting as less than a man in submitting to Eve's leadership. But the authority of the woman as helpmeet is no less real than that of a prime minister to a king. The prime minister is not a slave because he is not king, nor is the woman a slave because she is not a man. The description of a virtuous woman or a godly wife in Proverbs 31:10-31 is not of a helpless slave nor of a pretty parasite, but rather of a very competent wife, manager, businesswoman, and mother, a person of real authority. The key, therefore, to the biblical doctrine of the family is to be found in the fact of its central authority and the meaning thereof.